My name is Jeremy Irwin, and I'd like to talk to you about an old dressmaking manual that I tinkered with a few years back. This is Iulia Oshin's 1911 book, Cutting and Sewing, a curiosity I bought because it had information on drafting a made-to-measure corset. It also has patterns for sewing children's wear, coats, jackets, dresses, and menswear, and generalized sewing instructions, but those were of little consequence to me next to the incredibly rare recipe for a corset. I was somewhat familiar with Russian pattern making systems from reading this 1890 book from the Library of Congress. Interestingly, the patterns in Oshin's book look to be out of style by 1911, and so an 1890s reference was really quite useful. Besides the hundreds of patterns, there is information on how to finish a garment, where to install hooks and eyes, trims, linings, and so on. But due to extremely limited Russian skills, I cannot say whether the information substantially expands on, say, Butterick. I took some of the pattern drafts and tried to reconstruct them into a drafting program of my own design so you could see how they work. It does save quite a bit of paper. So let us begin with the bodices. They essentially share this structure right here. A few auxiliary measurements are faked by using proportional measurements, 1/8 of the half bust, 3/16 of the half bust, etc. Oshin offers several different bodice designs: the Parisian, the Viennese, the English, the German. I do not know whether these truly represent the local fashion styles or whether they're intended to give an air of exoticism to customers and dressmakers. Nevertheless, you can see that some have sloping fronts, some have slightly different curves in their backs, some have twice divided backs, and some offer décolletage for dancing and dinner. There are other variations for figure variations. For instance, this is for a large woman with, unfortunately, a stooping back. This pattern represents a typical solution or style for large women. They'd see that the width of each panel was no longer than a certain amount, say 3 centimeters at the waist, and they'd add more panels to essentially break up the garment. I've drafted the Parisian garment dynamically so you can see how it works. So, for instance, bust, waist, hips, back length. Sometimes the pattern fails because the designer did not properly take into account such variation. Other variations don't really exist in the real world. So, and of course, my code is not perfect. This pattern was relatively easy to reconstruct despite Oshin's use of a now lost ruler to locate point P9 right here. The remainder of the pattern hanged upon that point, so I imagine how disappointed I felt that it relied on an artifact which might not even exist anymore. I used the other 1890s book to decide on a solution, and it turns out that by drawing a line between, say, P9 and P8 and at its midpoint, constructing a perpendicular, you can control the curvature of this particular line. And if you want it to be, say, 1 centimeter away from this imaginary chord, then then you can easily place P9 on the curve where the P7, P8 thing. Anyway, it works, and I was able to reconstruct the rest of the pattern. Here is a sleeve pattern, and it's a fairly conventional sleeve. If this was a real 1890s book, they would have lots of novelty sleeves that were based on this particular pattern base. But since this is 1911, in reality, the sleeves are conventional and stayed. I think the only variations exist for the men get a new slave, and I believe there might be traditional slaves buried in the book. But here is it dynamically. So very boring. And notice that its 2 is based on an eighth of a major measurement. Here is a chapter on underwear. I've selected 2 patterns to show you. The first is a simple pair of drawers that comes in 2 patterns. From one is the waistband, and the other is the drawer themselves. The waistband just depends on the waist. And the drawers themselves are based on the hips. and you can change the length. Sorry about that. You can change the length of the drawers themselves to suit fashion or whatever. Let me scale it down a bit. Here is an absolutely huge pattern for a combination garment, and it requires a lot of paper to even draft this thing. It doesn't even fit on my screen. So it's a combination of, say, a camisole and I believe it's going haywire. And briefs, and you can change various things. I have no idea why it's curving out like that. There it is. Snapping back to place. And here is the corset pattern. It's a typical 19th century corset and a straight front hourglass, but that's okay since I'm looking for an hourglass pattern. This has a superimposed underbust corset with high over the hips and lower of the hips and over the bust. The problem, it was a real problem to get the curves on the drafting method. I might have to clean that up a bit, so behold. I'd like you to observe that certain allowances are made in very specific parts of the pattern. And nothing grows truly proportionally as if it was scaled. So this concludes my presentation. I haven't worked on this particular book recently because of recent events and because I've discovered a cache of French patterns and German patterns, which I can more easily read and enjoy. But I'm willing to offer my assistance should you be interested.